The movie opens with a poignant scene of a father, Paul Maguire, picking up his beloved daughter, Caitlin Maguire, from school. On their way home, Caitlin eagerly asks for permission to have a friend over that night. Paul, being the protective father that he is, agrees only if she completes her schoolwork first. Later that night, we see Paul at a bar with his two closest friends, Danny Doherty and Kane. Over drinks, Paul seeks their advice on how to make Caitlin's upcoming birthday celebration special. Kane suggests holding the party at his bar, and Danny suggests that Paul ensure there are no drugs or alcohol present. Paul agrees wholeheartedly, determined to shield Caitlin from the dangers he faced as a former gangster. The scene transitions to Paul attending a groundbreaking ceremony for a project he is working on as a contractor. The event is attended by the mayor, highlighting Paul's success in turning his life around after leaving his dangerous gangster lifestyle behind. As the day comes to an end, we see Paul and his second wife, Vanessa Maguire, getting ready for a dinner with officials. Vanessa is Paul's loving partner, who he married after the death of his first wife. As Paul prepares to leave for his dinner, he encounters his daughter, Caitlin, and her friends, Mike and Evan. Being the loving father he is, Paul takes a moment to remind them of the importance of completing their schoolwork before allowing them to go out. He also has a heart-to-heart conversation with Mike, asking if he uses illegal drugs. Mike confesses that he can't afford drugs, being from a less wealthy family. Meanwhile, Vanessa cautions Caitlin against smoking, reminding her of the cigarette butts Paul found around their home. Later that evening, Paul and Vanessa arrive at the dinner venue and discuss their project with the officials present. Suddenly, a police detective named Peter Street, John, interrupts the dinner to deliver shocking news. Caitlin has been kidnapped. Without hesitation, Paul and Vanessa rush back home to confront the unfolding crisis head-on. Upon arriving home, Paul and Vanessa are met with devastating news. Their beloved daughter, Caitlin, has been kidnapped. Peter, the police detective, recounts the details of the incident based on information from Caitlin's friends, Mike and Evan. The group of masked men stormed into the house, beating up Mike and Evan before taking Caitlin away. Paul is left confused and unsure of the motive behind the kidnapping, as he has turned his life around and has no known enemies. However, Peter suggests that it could be related to Paul's past as a gangster. Vanessa pleads with Paul to do whatever it takes to save Caitlin, whom she loves deeply despite not being her biological daughter. As days passed, Vanessa continued to mourn the loss of her daughter, while Paul was consumed by memories of his dark past as a gangster. In a rush, he donned a jacket and hurried off, haunted by the memory of Ivan, a Russian gangster whose younger brother he had kidnapped and killed. Paul then went to Mike's house to question him about the kidnappers, but the traumatized boy was too scared to provide much information. All Mike could do was apologize to Paul for his inability to help. He then seeks the help of his friends Danny and Kane to track down the kidnappers. They visit a notorious criminal who denies any involvement and suggests that kidnapping the daughter of a former gangster is a foolish move. Meanwhile, a jogger discovers a dead body floating in a river, and Caitlin's body is later found. Detective Hansen informs Paul of the tragedy, leaving him deeply distraught. Paul, Kane, and Danny gather to discuss the death of Caitlin and try to figure out who was responsible for it. Kane suggested that their past crime of robbing and killing Ivan might be related to Caitlin's death, but Paul was not convinced since he thought there were no witnesses at the time. Later, Paul met with his former boss, Francis, who warned him not to take matters into his own hands and break the law. Despite the warning, Paul was determined to find the killer and bring justice to his daughter. As the sun began to rise, Hansen rushed to Peter with devastating news. Caitlin, a close friend, had been brutally murdered with a Soviet Tokarev TT-33 pistol, a weapon notorious for its ties to the Chernov family, a notorious mafia organization. This was the same family that Paul and his best friend had taken down after the brutal killing of Ivan, the brother of the current boss, Chernov. The next day, Kane approached Paul with the details of Caitlin's death. It was a chilling realization that the Chernov family had sought revenge against Paul, and they had used their signature weapon to do it. Furious and without hesitation, Paul summoned Cain to join him on a dangerous mission to confront Chernov at his own casino. Paul arrived at Chernov's casino seething with anger, and without hesitation, he took down every one of Chernov's men. Afterward, Paul went home and had a sobering realization. Vanessa's safety was at risk because of his actions. He urged her to leave the city for a while to avoid any potential harm. As the day wore on, and with no response from Chernov, Paul and his two friends decided to track down Ivan's personal driver, Vori, at a nearby bar. Paul instructed his friends to wait in the car while he confronted Vori alone. When Vori saw Paul approaching, he looked terrified and tried to flee. However, Danny, who had been keeping an eye on Vori, fired his gun, hitting the driver, but Vori still managed to escape. Despite Vori's escape, Paul was relentless in his pursuit and eventually caught up with him. Desperate for answers, Paul questioned Vori about Chernov's involvement in the kidnapping and murder of his daughter. Sadly, Vori had passed away before he could provide any information, leaving Paul without any new leads. The scene then shifts to Paul sitting in a bar, frustrated and consumed by grief. Just then, Peter arrives and tries to console him, reminding Paul that revenge will never bring back his daughter, Caitlin. However, as a father who has lost his child, Paul cannot be swayed from his quest for vengeance. As night fell, Paul led his two friends to a house where Chernov's illicit drug business was located. Upon entering, they swiftly took down each of Chernov's men one by one. The following day, the police arrived at the scene, and Peter suspected that Paul was the culprit. However, rather than being angry, Peter expressed his gratitude, knowing that the individuals Paul had eliminated were dangerous fugitives who would have been difficult to catch otherwise. As news of the attack on Chernov's drug business spread, his men reported to him that a former gangster was causing chaos. Chernov was confused as he had no known enemies and ordered his men to apprehend Paul and his accomplice for disrupting his operation. Later, Chernov and his men arrived at Cain's bar looking for Paul. Cain, recognizing the danger, quickly hid and alerted Paul of the situation. Paul, who was on the road, received the call and immediately rushed to the bar, trying to reach Danny along the way, but to no avail. At the bar, Cain found himself outnumbered and under attack, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He took out his gun and tried to fend off the attackers. Despite his best efforts, he eventually succumbed to Chernov's men. Meanwhile, Paul was on his way to the bar when he saw Cain being abducted by Chernov's henchmen. Without hesitation, Paul pursued their car, determined to rescue his friend. But as luck would have it, the police blocked his path, allowing the villains to escape with Cain. Paul's actions didn't go unnoticed, however. When he was arrested, his friend Peter came to his aid, reminding the authorities of Paul's past heroism. To make matters even more interesting, the person Paul was chasing was actually a fugitive from the law. With this in mind, Paul was ultimately released and hailed as a hero for his valiant efforts to help the police catch a criminal. The scene was bleak and abandoned, with Cain lying helplessly as he was tortured by Chernov, a powerful man with a violent streak. Chernov demanded to know why Cain and his friends were causing trouble in his business. At first, Cain remained tight-lipped, but as the beating continued, he finally revealed that it was because Chernov had killed Caitlin, Paul's daughter. Chernov was taken aback by the accusation, as he did not remember ever harming Caitlin. Cain then explained that Chernov had a motive for killing her, as revenge for the death of Ivan, Chernov's younger brother, 20 years ago. It was a shocking revelation for Chernov, who was now consumed with anger and a thirst for revenge. He ordered his men to bring Francis, who was Cain's boss 20 years ago, and who had ordered Ivan's death. Meanwhile, Paul was seething with anger as he went to confront Danny, who was caught up in the arms of a woman. Paul was disappointed that Danny seemed to be having the time of his life and wouldn't pick up the phone. He also suspected that Danny had betrayed him, especially since he had shot Vori, who could have been their only lead. Danny denied the accusations, claiming that he needed some fun, but Paul was too angry to listen, and in a fit of rage, he unknowingly stabbed Danny to death. At the same time, Francis came face to face with Chernov, who was holding Cain's lifeless body. Without a moment's hesitation, Chernow held Francis responsible for the death of Ivan at the hands of Cain and his gang, who were once Francis's men. Francis denied giving the order to kill Ivan, but the two sides could not find a common ground. The tension escalated and shots were fired, with Francis caught in the crossfire while confined to his wheelchair. Chernow had no mercy, pointing his gun at Francis and ending his life with a single shot. As Paul drove through the night, memories flooded his mind of the day he had killed Ivan and kept his gun as a trophy. Upon reaching his house, he quickly checked the storage box and noticed that some bullets were missing. It suddenly dawned on him that Caitlin's killers were her friends who had visited his house not too long ago. Determined to get to the truth, Paul called Mike for a meeting and grilled him relentlessly until he finally confessed. It turned out that when they were all drunk, Caitlin had shown Ivan Paul's gun and the trio had been playing with it. In a freak accident, Mike had pulled the trigger and Caitlin had died. Panicking, they disposed of her body under a bridge and staged a fake kidnapping and robbery at Paul's house. As Mike poured his heart out, Paul realized that Caitlin's death was a tragic accident. Despite Mike's pleas for death, Paul chose to let him live and left him there, alone with his guilt. As soon as Paul arrived home, he immediately called Vanessa to apologize for everything that had happened and begged her to return home. Unfortunately, before Vanessa could arrive, Chernow and his men showed up at Paul's house to arrest him. Overwhelmed with guilt for the death of his two best friends, Paul tragically took his own life. Although Paul's death ultimately saved Vanessa from Chernow's pursuit, it left both Vanessa and Peter devastated. In the final scene of the movie, we see Vanessa and the police arriving to remove Paul's body from the house. Vanessa is clearly heartbroken by the loss of the man she loved, while Peter mourns the death of a former gangster who had often helped him. The powerful message of the movie is that acting impulsively and in anger only leads to more problems, and that taking the time to calmly solve problems is the best approach.